They called it a runaway case. 15-year-old Timothy Jackson, gone without a trace on a crisp October morning in 1975. Just another black kid from the wrong side of Millbrook Heights who probably got mixed up with trouble. That's what the police file said. That's what the newspapers reported. That's what everyone believed. Everyone except his mother, June, who knew her son would never abandon his newspaper route, his dreams of journalism, or the family that meant everything to him. For 33 years, she searched alone in a basement lined with maps and memories, chasing leads while questions multiplied like shadows. Then in 2008, a wrecking ball brought down more than just walls. It brought down lies. What June discovered wasn't random disappearance or teenage rebellion. It was something far more sinister, orchestrated by the very people sworn to protect her community. TJ hadn't run away. He'd stumbled onto a secret that powerful men would kill to protect. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed. The autumn. Morning of October 15th, 1975, dawned crisp and clear in Millbrook Heights, a small suburban community just outside St. Louis. Timothy Jackson, known to everyone as TJ, was already awake before sunrise, moving quietly through the small house. He shared with his mother, June. At 15, TJ was different from most kids his age. While his classmates slept in on Saturday mornings, he was dressed and ready for his newspaper route. His pressed white button-up shirt was tucked into flared jeans, canvas sneakers spotless, despite their age. The newspaper route wasn't just a job for TJ. It was his window into the world he hoped to write about someday. Millbrook Heights existed in two worlds. The eastern side, where TJ lived, housed working-class black families who had moved there seeking better opportunities. The western side remained predominantly white, with larger homes and residents who commuted to downtown St. Louis. TJ's route covered both sides, making him one of the few who crossed the invisible racial divide daily. "Morning, TJ," called Mrs. Washington from her porch as he wheeled his yellow banana seat bicycle from the garage. "Morning, Mrs. Washington. Beautiful day, isn't it?" TJ replied, adjusting the canvas bag heavy with Saturday's edition. TJ's first stop was always Mr. Coleman's house. The elderly Korean War veteran appreciated having his paper delivered to his door rather than thrown on the lawn. "Right on time, as always," Mr. Coleman said from his wheelchair. "Punctuality is a virtue that'll serve you well in life." "Yes, sir. My mama always says if you're not early, you're late." TJ grinned. "Smart woman. How's she doing with those long shifts at the hospital?" "She's tired, but she says helping people gives her energy. I think I get my curiosity from her. She's always asking patients about their lives." Mr. Coleman studied the young man. TJ had that rare combination of intelligence and kindness that reminded him of his own son. "You're going to do great things, son." As TJ continued through the eastern side, he exchanged greetings with familiar faces. Reverend Williams was in his garden despite the season's end. "TJ, come here for a second," the Reverend called. TJ parked his bike. "Yes, sir? I wanted to thank you for helping Mrs. Bradley with her groceries last week. She told me you carried her bags from the bus stop to her door." "It wasn't any trouble, Reverend. She reminded me of my grandmother." "That's what I'm talking about. Your heart's in the right place, son. Keep that goodness, no matter what this world throws at you." The conversation stuck with TJ as he pedaled toward the western side. The houses gradually grew larger, lawns more pristine, cars newer and more expensive. This was where his route became challenging, not because of distance but because of reception. Most customers were polite enough, though some left payment on porches rather than answer doors. A few, like Mrs. Patterson, always invited him in for water and asked about his studies, but others made him uncomfortable, like Mr. Brennan, who watched from his window with an unreadable expression, or Mr. Langston, who lived in the biggest house on Elm Street and had once called TJ one of the good ones. It was at the Langston house where TJ had his most unsettling encounter 2 weeks prior. He'd been delivering the paper when he heard shouting from inside. Through a partially open window, he'd glimpsed a man, presumably Mr. Langston, grabbing a young boy roughly by the shoulders. The boy was crying, and something in the scene made TJ's stomach turn. When Mr. Langston emerged to collect his paper, his demeanor changed completely, all smiles and small talk, but his eyes held a warning TJ felt deep in his bones. "You didn't see anything unusual today, did you, boy?" Langston had asked, his voice carrying strange intensity. "No, sir. Just delivering papers like always," TJ had replied, though his hands shook as he rode away. That incident had been weighing on TJ's mind for days. During journalism class, they discussed the importance of speaking truth to power and protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. His teacher emphasized that real journalists had a responsibility to shine light into dark corners, even when it was uncomfortable or dangerous. On this particular Saturday morning, TJ's mind was occupied with these thoughts as he completed his route on the western side. He had one final delivery, a house on Oak Street that had recently changed hands. The new resident, Harold Vaughn, had been added to his route just the week before. The Vaughn house was different from others on Oak Street. While neighbors maintained their properties meticulously, Vaughn's house had an air of neglect. Paint was peeling, shutters hung at odd angles, and the yard was overgrown with weeds. TJ had only met Vaughn once. A thin, pale man with nervous eyes that darted around constantly. As TJ approached the house that morning, he noticed the front door was slightly ajar, and he could hear voices from inside, one sounding urgent, almost desperate. TJ hesitated, his hand hovering over the paper in his bag. His instincts told him to leave the paper and go, but something about the tone of voices concerned him. He knocked gently on the doorframe. "Mr. Vaughn, it's TJ with your paper." The voices stopped abruptly. After a moment, Harold Vaughn appeared, looking more disheveled than usual. His shirt was wrinkled, dark circles under his eyes. "Oh, TJ, right, the paper." Vaughn's voice was shaky. "Just leave it on the porch, would you?" "Are you all right, sir? You seem upset." Vaughn's eyes darted past TJ to the street as if checking for something. "I'm fine, everything's fine. You should go now." As Vaughn started to close the door, TJ heard another voice from inside, a voice he recognized. It was Mr. Langston, and he sounded angry. "Is that the newspaper boy? Get him in here." TJ's blood ran cold. "I should go," TJ said quickly, backing away. "I've got other deliveries." But Vaughn had already opened the door wider, and TJ could see Mr. Langston standing in the hallway behind him. The older man's face was red with anger, eyes holding the same warning TJ had seen 2 weeks earlier. "TJ, isn't it?" Langston said, his voice deceptively calm. "Come in for a moment. We need to have a conversation." Every instinct TJ possessed screamed at him to run, but his feet felt frozen. He'd been raised to respect his elders, to be polite and compliant, but everything about this situation felt dangerous. "I really should get going, Mr. Langston. My mama's expecting me home for lunch." "This will only take a minute," Langston said, stepping closer. "We need to discuss some things you might have seen during your paper route, things that could be misunderstood." TJ's mind raced. He thought about the crying boy he'd glimpsed, about the way Langston had questioned him afterward, about the strange urgency in the voices he'd just heard. He thought about his mother, probably preparing lunch and worrying if he was late. He thought about his dreams of becoming a journalist, of uncovering truth and protecting the innocent. "I haven't seen anything. Mr. Langston, I just deliver papers." "That's good to hear," Langston said, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. "But I think we should talk about it anyway. Make sure we understand each other." Behind Langston, TJ caught a glimpse of someone else in the shadows. a younger person, possibly a boy, who seemed to be cowering against the wall. That decided it. For TJ, whatever was happening in this house wasn't right, and he wasn't going to be part of covering it up. "I have to go," he said firmly, turning away. He didn't look back as he ran to his bicycle, but he could hear Langston calling after him. "TJ, come back here! We're not finished!" TJ pedaled harder than he'd ever pedaled before, his heart pounding and mind racing. He needed to get home, needed to tell his mother what had happened, needed to figure out what to do about what he'd seen and heard. But as he rode through the neighborhood, taking shortcuts through alleys and side streets, he became aware of a car following him. In his rearview mirror, he could see a dark sedan maintaining careful distance behind him. TJ turned down Maple Street, then quickly cut through the parking lot behind the old Methodist church. The car followed. He pedaled through the narrow path between two houses, emerging onto Pine Street. The car was still there, now closer than before. Panic began to set in. TJ's house was still 6 blocks away, and he was becoming increasingly certain that the car was deliberately following him. He thought about stopping at one of his customers' houses. But what if that put them in danger too? Instead, he made a decision that would haunt his mother for the rest of her life. Rather than leading the car to his house, TJ turned toward the old abandoned section of the neighborhood, a cluster of houses scheduled for demolition but sitting empty for months due to bureaucratic delays. He figured he could lose the car in the maze of overgrown lots and boarded-up houses, then circle back home once it was safe. It was a plan born of fear and adrenaline, the kind of split-second decision that seems logical in the moment but proves fatal in hindsight. The last anyone would see of TJ Jackson was his yellow banana seat bicycle, found 3 hours later by children playing in the empty lot behind the abandoned houses on Willow Street. The bike was lying on its side, the canvas newspaper bag torn and scattered with undelivered papers that danced in the autumn wind. When June Jackson came home from her shift at the hospital that evening, expecting to find her son doing homework, at the kitchen table she found instead an empty house and a growing knot of terror in her stomach that would never fully leave her. The years following TJ's disappearance moved like a slow, relentless river, carrying away hope one day at a time, while leaving behind an accumulation of questions that would define June Jackson's existence for over 3 decades. By winter 1976, the official search for Timothy Jackson had been reduced to a single folder in a metal cabinet at the Millbrook Heights Police Department. Detective Ray Morrison, the only officer who had taken the case seriously, had been transferred after asking too many uncomfortable questions about certain prominent families. June watched the investigation crumble with a mixture of rage and despair that crystallized into something harder: determination. If the police wouldn't find her son, she would find him herself. The basement of their small house became June's command center. She'd converted the space that once held TJ's bicycle into a shrine of investigation. Cork boards lined the walls, covered with maps, newspaper clippings, photographs, and timelines written in her careful nurse's handwriting. Red string connected various pieces of information, sightings, tips, theories, and dead ends she refused to abandon. "Mrs. Jackson." The voice belonged to 8-year-old Cassidy Miller, whose family had moved 3 doors down in spring 1977. The little blonde girl had been fascinated by the mystery of the missing boy from the moment she'd heard the story. June looked up from a newspaper clipping about a black teenager found in Chicago who'd turned out not to be TJ. "Yes, sweetheart? My mom said I shouldn't bother you, but I found something." Cassidy held up a faded photograph. "I was cleaning our attic, and this was stuck behind a box. It was in our house when we moved in." June's hands trembled as she took the photograph. It showed TJ standing next to his bicycle, but he wasn't alone. A man stood beside him, middle-aged, wearing a dark coat with his hand on TJ's shoulder. The man's face was partially obscured by shadows, but June could see enough to know she'd never seen him before. "Where exactly did you find this, baby?" "Wedged. Way back behind some old boxes. There were other papers too, but they were too damaged to read." June studied the photograph with the intensity of someone examining a treasure map. TJ looked happy, smiling his bright smile, but something about the man's posture suggested a familiarity that made June uncomfortable. Who was he? When had this been taken, and why had it been hidden? As Cassidy grew older, her fascination with TJ's case only deepened. She would spend hours in June's basement, listening to theories and helping organize clippings. When she was 12, she announced she wanted to be a detective. When she was 16, she'd narrowed it down to criminal psychology. By high school graduation in 1987, she'd already been accepted to the University of Missouri's criminology program. "I'm going to find out what happened to TJ," she told June the day before leaving for college. "I promise you that." June, now in her 50s and showing the wear of decades of hope and disappointment, hugged the young woman who'd become like a daughter. "You don't owe me anything, Cassidy. You've got your own life to live." "TJ's story is part of my life now," Cassidy replied. "It always will be." Meanwhile, in Chicago, TJ's younger cousin Devin was coming to a similar realization. Devin had been only 5 when TJ disappeared, but the loss had cast a shadow over his entire childhood. Family gatherings were marked by June's empty chair and the weight of unspoken grief. Devin's path to journalism hadn't been direct. He'd started college as a business major, but a required English class awakened something in him. When the professor assigned a personal essay, Devin had written about TJ's disappearance and how it shaped his family's life. The professor had been so moved that she'd encouraged Devin to consider journalism. "You have a gift for finding the human story in tragedy," she'd told him. "That's what the best journalists do. They find truth in places where others only see pain." By 1995, Devin was working as a reporter for the Chicago Tribune, specializing in cold cases and unsolved crimes. He'd never forgotten his promise to investigate TJ's disappearance, but the years filled themselves with other urgent stories, other families seeking justice. It was a phone call from Cassidy that finally brought TJ's case back to the forefront. "Of both their lives, Devin. It's Cassidy Miller. I don't know if you remember me, but I grew up next door to your Aunt June." "Of course I remember you. How is June?" "She's struggling, but that's not why I'm calling." Cassidy's voice carried excitement that made Devin sit up straighter. "I work for the Missouri State Crime Lab now, and something's come up. A case that might be connected to TJ." Cassidy had been working on a project to digitize old case files when she'd come across something that made her blood run cold. In 1983, construction workers renovating a house in nearby Crescent Hills had found human remains in the basement. The remains were those of a young black male, estimated to be between 14 and 16 at time of death. Without dental records or DNA technology, identification had proved impossible. The remains were buried in a county cemetery under a marker reading simply, "Unknown Youth, 1983. What caught Cassidy's attention wasn't just the age and description, it was the location. Crescent Hills was only 15 miles from Millbrook Heights, connected by the same bus route TJ had used occasionally. "I've been going through missing persons reports from the same period," Cassidy explained. "There were 3 other boys who disappeared from the area between 1974 and 1976, all black, all between 14 and 17, and none received much attention from law enforcement." Devin felt his reporter's instincts kick in. "You think they might be connected?" "I think there's a pattern nobody bothered to look for back then, and with DNA technology now, you want to exhume the remains and test them against TJ's DNA." "Exactly. But I need help navigating the legal process and someone with media connections who can put pressure on the right people if they try to stonewall us." Devin looked at the framed photograph on his desk, a picture of himself as a child with TJ at a family barbecue, just months before TJ's disappearance. In the photo, TJ was lifting young Devon onto his shoulders, both laughing at something outside. "The camera's view. I'm in," he said. "Whatever you need." The process of getting permission to exhume the remains and conduct DNA testing took nearly 2 years. There were bureaucratic hurdles, legal challenges, and resistance from officials who seemed more interested in keeping old cases closed than finding answers. But Cassidy and Devon were relentless, and their combined expertise proved formidable. In spring 2005, they finally got their breakthrough. The DNA extracted from the remains in Crescent Hills was compared to a sample taken from TJ's old toothbrush, which June had kept for 30 years like a shrine to hope. The results were negative. The remains weren't TJ's, but the investigation had attracted attention from the new police chief in Millbrook Heights, Robert Hayes, who'd been hired to modernize the department and address systemic problems. Hayes had heard about Cassidy and Devon's work and reached out with an offer. "I've been reviewing old case files since I took this job," Hayes told them during a meeting. "The Jackson case has been bothering me for months. The original investigation was sloppy at best, and there are gaps that suggest important evidence was overlooked or deliberately ignored." Hayes spread out crime scene photos from 1975, TJ's abandoned bicycle, and scattered newspapers. But there were other photos too, taken at different angles and showing details that hadn't been mentioned in original reports. "Look at this," Hayes said, pointing to one photo. "See those tire tracks in the mud behind where the bike was found? They were never cast or analyzed. And here," he pointed to another, "footprints leading away from the bike, heading toward the old Vaughan house." Cassidy studied the photos with a trained eye. "Harold Vaughan, he disappeared the same week as TJ." "That's right. His disappearance was treated as completely unrelated, just a mentally ill man who wandered off. But what if it wasn't?" Hayes had done his own research into Harold Vaughan's background and uncovered disturbing information. Vaughan had been a police officer in the 1960s, but was forced to resign after accusations of excessive force and psychological instability. He'd been living on disability payments and had become increasingly reclusive. Neighbors reported strange noises from his house at night, Hayes continued, digging sounds, sometimes shouting. There were also reports of children's pets going missing, cats and dogs that were never found. Devon felt a chill. "You think Vaughan took TJ?" "I think Vaughan knew something about what happened. Maybe he was involved, maybe just a witness, but his timing is too convenient to ignore." The breakthrough came in summer 2007, when the city finally began long-delayed demolition of abandoned houses in the old section of Millbrook Heights. A construction crew working on the Vaughan house made a discovery that would finally provide answers to questions that had haunted the community for over 3 decades. The crew had been breaking down walls in the basement when they found something that didn't belong, a section of newer brickwork built over what appeared to be a small room or storage area. When they broke through the bricks, they found a space that had been sealed off from the rest of the basement. Inside that hidden room, they found evidence that made their blood run cold. Pieces of a canvas newspaper bag, scraps of newspapers dated October 1975, and a metal name tag with TJ etched into the surface. The call came to June Jackson on a Tuesday afternoon while she was working at the hospital. Chief Hayes's voice was gentle but direct. "Mrs. Jackson, I need you to come down to the station. We've found something." June's legs gave out when she saw the name tag. After 32 years of searching, of hoping, of refusing to give up, she finally had proof of what had happened to her son. The relief was overwhelming, but it was accompanied by a grief so profound that she couldn't speak for several minutes. The news spread through Millbrook Heights like wildfire. Within hours, news trucks were parked on every corner. Reporters were knocking on doors, and the quiet suburban community found itself at the center of a national story about a missing boy, a cover-up, and the persistence of a mother's love. But for June Jackson, the media attention was secondary to the one thing she'd been waiting 32 years to hear. Her son was finally coming home. The forensic confirmation came on a cold, January morning in 2008. June Jackson sat in Chief Hayes' office, flanked by Cassidy and Devin, as the medical examiner delivered the news they'd all been expecting but dreading. "The remains are those of Timothy Jackson," Dr. Sarah Chen said gently. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Jackson. At least now you have answers." June closed her eyes and let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding for 33 years. The relief was overwhelming, not because her son was dead, but because the not knowing was finally over. "How did he die?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Dr. Chen's expression was grave. "The evidence suggests he was killed shortly after his disappearance. The remains are too deteriorated to determine specific cause of death, but I can tell you he didn't suffer for long." It was a small comfort, but June held onto it like a lifeline. Cassidy, now 39 and one of the state's most respected criminal investigators, had been working around the clock since the discovery. The hidden room in Harold Vaughan's basement had yielded more than just TJ's remains. There were other items, clothing fragments, personal effects, and most disturbing of all, evidence suggesting TJ hadn't been Vaughan's only victim. "We need to talk about Harold Vaughn," Cassidy said, spreading files on Hayes' desk. "I've been digging into his background, and what I found is disturbing." Devin, now an award-winning investigative journalist, leaned forward. At 38, he'd covered dozens of similar cases, but this one was personal in a way that made his hands shake as he took notes. "Vaughn wasn't just a disturbed loner," Cassidy continued. "He had connections to several missing children cases in the area dating back to the early 1970s. I found at least 4 other boys who disappeared under similar circumstances, and in each case, Vaughn lived within a few miles of where they were last seen." Chief Hayes pulled out a map of the greater St. Louis area and began marking locations with red pins. "Show me." Marcus Thompson, age 14, disappeared from University City in 1973. Vaughn was living 6 blocks away. Cassidy placed a pin on the map. David Wilson, 16, vanished from Webster Groves in 1974. Vaughn had moved to a house 2 miles from where David was last seen. As Cassidy continued placing pins, a pattern emerged that made everyone in the room uncomfortable. Vaughn had moved frequently in the early 1970s, and each move seemed to coincide with the disappearance of a young black boy in the area. "But here's what's really interesting," Devin added, consulting his notes. "I've been researching Vaughan's employment history. He wasn't just a former cop. He was working as a security consultant for several neighborhood watch groups in the mid-1970s. "Neighborhood watch groups?" Hayes asked. "Unofficial ones. Citizens groups that formed in response to school desegregation and the civil rights movement. They claimed concern about crime and property values, but from what I can tell, they were really about keeping black families from moving into white neighborhoods." Cassidy nodded grimly. "And Harold Vaughn was specifically recruited because of his law enforcement background. He was supposed to provide professional guidance on how to deal with troublemakers." The implications were chilling. What if TJ's disappearance hadn't been the random act of a disturbed individual, but part of a systematic campaign of intimidation and violence? "There's something else," Devin said, pulling out a thick folder. "I've been going through newspaper archives from the 1970s, looking for any mention of these neighborhood watch groups. Most operated under different names: Citizens for Community Safety, Neighborhood Preservation Society. But they all had one thing in common. They were funded by donations from prominent local business leaders." He spread out several newspaper clippings. "And one name keeps coming up as a major donor: Gregory Langston Sr." June looked up sharply. Langston? That's the man whose house TJ was uncomfortable about. The same family, Cassidy confirmed. And Gregory Langston Jr. is currently running for the U.S. Senate. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. This wasn't just about Harold Vaughn or even TJ's murder. This was potentially about a conspiracy involving some of the most powerful people in the region. Hayes rubbed his temples. We need to be very careful here. These are serious accusations against prominent people. We need concrete evidence, not just speculation. We have evidence, Cassidy said firmly. I've been in contact with some of Vaughn's former neighbors. Mrs. Dorothy Banks lived next door to him in 1975. She's 86 now, but her memory is sharp. She remembers seeing TJ at Vaughn's house the day he disappeared. She saw TJ there? June's voice was sharp with emotion. More than that, she saw him arguing with someone, a man in an expensive car who'd been coming to Vaughn's house regularly. She couldn't see the man's face clearly, but she remembered the car, a dark blue Cadillac with distinctive chrome trim. Devin was already flipping through his notes. Gregory Langston Sr. owned a 1974 Cadillac Eldorado, dark blue with chrome trim. I found the registration records. Hayes stood up and began pacing. This is all circumstantial. We need more than just a car description and proximity to missing children. Then let's get more, Cassidy said. I want to re-examine the physical evidence from Vaughn's house. The forensics team in 1975 barely scratched the surface. With modern techniques, we might find DNA evidence, fingerprints, anything that could link other people to the scene. Over the next several weeks, Cassidy assembled a team of forensic experts to re-examine every inch of the Vaughn property. What they found exceeded expectations. The hidden room where TJ's remains had been discovered was just the beginning. Beneath, layers of concrete and dirt in the basement, they found evidence of other burials, bone fragments, pieces of clothing, and personal items belonging to at least 3 other victims. But it was what they found in the walls that proved most significant. Hidden behind a false panel in the basement's back wall, they discovered a small cache of documents and photographs that Harold Vaughn had apparently been keeping as insurance. The documents included meeting notes from neighborhood watch groups, financial records showing payments to Vaughn from various sources, and most damning of all, a series of letters signed by Gregory Langston Sr. The letters detailed specific instructions for dealing with problem individuals who were threatening the character of our community. One letter, dated just days before TJ's disappearance, was particularly explicit. Harold, the Jackson boy, has become a liability. His mother's questions are drawing unwanted attention, and his own observations could compromise our entire operation. This situation needs to be resolved permanently. I trust you understand the implications. Destroy this letter after reading. G.L. This is it, Devin said, his voice shaking with excitement and horror. This is proof that Langston ordered TJ's murder. But even as evidence mounted, they encountered resistance. Within hours of the letter's discovery, they received a call from the mayor's office requesting a meeting. The mayor, flanked by the city attorney and a representative from the Langston family's legal team, made it clear that the investigation was making powerful people uncomfortable. We need to be very careful about how we proceed, the mayor said. The Langston family has been a pillar of this community for generations. We can't allow baseless accusations to destroy their reputation. Chief Hayes stood his ground. With respect, sir, this isn't about reputation. This is about justice for a murdered child. Of course it is, the mayor replied smoothly, but we also have to consider broader implications. Gregory Langston Jr. is running for the Senate. A scandal like this could affect his campaign and, by extension, the entire region's political future. The message was clear. The investigation was threatening people with the power to shut it down. That night, June Jackson received the first of several anonymous phone calls. "Drop the investigation or you'll join your son," a voice whispered before hanging up. Similar calls came to Cassidy and Devon. Someone was clearly trying to intimidate them into backing down, but the threats only strengthened their resolve. "They're scared," Cassidy said during a late-night meeting in June's kitchen. "People don't make threats unless they have something to hide." The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. James Thornton had been a young physician in 1975, just starting his practice in Millbrook Heights. Now in his 70s and battling cancer, he'd been following news coverage of TJ's case with growing unease. Dr. Thornton called Chief Hayes on a Thursday evening, his voice weak but determined. "I need to tell you something about Harold Vaughan. Something I should have reported 30 years ago." Hayes met with Thornton the next morning. The elderly man was clearly in the final stages of illness, but his mind was sharp and his conscience heavy. "In October 1975, Harold Vaughan came to my office," Thornton began, hands shaking as he poured tea. "He had injuries, scratches on his face and arms, bruising on his knuckles. He claimed he'd fallen downstairs, but the injuries weren't consistent with that kind of accident." "What did you think they were consistent with?" Hayes asked gently. "A struggle, the kind of injuries you get when someone fights back." Thornton's eyes filled with tears. He was agitated, paranoid. He kept talking about having to clean up a mess for someone important. He said he couldn't go to the hospital because too many people would ask questions. Hayes felt his pulse quicken. "Did he mention any names?" "Not directly, but he said something. That's haunted me for 30 years. He said, 'Mr. G won't be happy if this gets out. He's got too much riding on keeping things quiet.' When I asked who Mr. G was, Vaughan just laughed and said I wouldn't believe him if he told me." The pieces were falling into place. Gregory Langston Sr., Mr. G, had been using Harold Vaughan to eliminate threats to his vision of how the community should remain. TJ, with his newspaper route that crossed racial lines and his keen eye for injustice, had seen something that threatened their operation. Armed with Dr. Thornton's testimony and evidence from Vaughan's house, Hayes and his team prepared to make arrests. But before they could act, they received devastating news. Harold Vaughan's house, secured as a crime scene, caught fire in the early hours of a Wednesday morning. The blaze was intense and fast-moving, destroying much of the remaining evidence. The fire department determined the cause was arson. Someone had deliberately set the fire using an accelerant. "They're trying to destroy the evidence," Cassidy said as they stood before the smoking ruins. "Someone knows we're getting close." But the arsonist had been too late. The most crucial evidence, TJ's remains, the hidden documents, and the forensic samples had already been removed and secured in the state crime lab. The fire had destroyed some secondary evidence, but the core of their case remained intact. The investigation took on new urgency. Hayes knew that whoever had ordered the arson wouldn't hesitate to eliminate witnesses if they felt cornered. Dr. Thornton was moved to a secure location, and protective details were assigned to June, Cassidy, and Devon. The final piece of the puzzle came from an unlikely source, Gregory Langston Jr. himself. Langston Jr. had been watching the investigation unfold with growing panic. As a Senate candidate, he couldn't afford to be associated with a murder conspiracy, even one orchestrated by his father decades earlier. When his campaign manager informed him that opposition researchers were starting to dig into his family's past, he made a decision that would change everything. He called Chief Hayes and requested a private meeting. They met in the office of Langston's attorney, a sterile conference room in downtown St. Louis. Langston Jr., now in his 50s, bore little resemblance to the frightened boy TJ had glimpsed in his father's house 33 years earlier. "I want to make a statement," Langston said without preamble, "about what happened in 1975. His attorney tried to intervene, but Langston waved him off. No, I need to say this. I've been carrying this secret for too long. What Langston revealed over the next hour painted a picture of systematic abuse and cover-up that went far beyond TJ's murder. Gregory Langston Sr. had been molesting his own son and several other boys in the neighborhood throughout the early 1970s. The neighborhood watch groups had been a front for identifying vulnerable children and silencing anyone who might expose. The abuse. TJ saw my father with me, Langston said, his voice breaking. In our house. I was 16, but I looked younger. TJ came to deliver a paper and he saw through a window. My father was hurting me. Hayes listened in stunned silence as Langston described how his father had discovered TJ's knowledge and immediately set plans in motion to silence him permanently. I didn't know what my father was planning, Langston continued. I just knew. TJ had seen something, and my father was furious. A few days later, TJ was gone, and my father told me that if I ever said anything about what happened in our house, I'd end up like the newspaper boy. The confession was devastating in its implications. Gregory Langston Sr. hadn't just been a racist trying to maintain segregation. He'd been a predator using his power and influence to abuse children and eliminate witnesses. Why are you telling us this now? Hayes asked. Langston looked out the window at the city skyline, where campaign posters bearing his name were visible on several buildings. Because I can't build a political career on my father's crimes, and because that boy, TJ, deserves justice. He was trying to protect me, and he died for it. The statement provided the final link in the chain of evidence. With Langston Jr.'s cooperation, prosecutors felt confident they had enough to pursue charges, even though the primary perpetrators were long dead. But the case was far from closed. As news of the confession leaked to the media, the story exploded across national headlines. The tale of a young black boy murdered for witnessing abuse, of a conspiracy involving prominent white families, and of a mother's 3-decade quest for justice captured the public imagination in a way that transcended regional boundaries. June Jackson found herself at the center of a media storm she'd never asked for. Reporters camped outside her house, producers called offering book and movie deals, and activists held rallies in TJ's memory. Through it all, she remained focused on the one thing that had driven her for 33 years, making sure the truth about her son was finally told. TJ would have been 48 years old this year, she told a reporter from 60 Minutes. He'd probably have children of his own by now, maybe grandchildren. But he never got that chance because he tried to do the right thing. The least I can do is make sure people remember that. The investigation continued, with authorities re-examining other cold cases that might be connected to the network of abuse and cover-up. But for June Jackson, the most important victory had already been won. Her son was no longer forgotten, and his story was finally being told. Cassidy stood in the rebuilt basement that had once been June's command center, now transformed into a proper memorial room with TJ's school photos, his newspaper bag, and letters from families whose own missing children cases had been reopened because of their work. "We did it," she whispered to the photo of TJ smiling in his school picture. "We found the truth." Devin was already working on his book about the case, knowing that TJ's story needed to be preserved for future generations. The boy who had dreamed of being a journalist had finally gotten his story told, even if he couldn't be there to write it himself. As the sun set over Millbrook Heights, casting long shadows across the neighborhood where TJ had once delivered papers and dreamed of changing the world, June Jackson finally allowed herself to feel something she hadn't experienced in 33 years: peace. Her son was coming home at last. Following Gregory Langston Jr.'s shocking confession, the investigation took on new momentum. Cassidy and her forensic team returned to Harold Vaughan's burned house with fresh eyes and advanced equipment. determined to uncover every secret the property might still hold. It was during this second examination that they made a discovery that would prove even more disturbing than TJ's remains. While using ground-penetrating radar to map the basement's original structure, technician Mike Patterson noticed an anomaly in the readings. "There's something behind this wall that doesn't match the rest of the foundation," Patterson told Cassidy, pointing to a section of the basement that appeared to be original construction, but showed different density readings. When they carefully removed the drywall, they found what Harold Vaughn had been most desperate to hide: a small room, barely 6 feet by 8 feet, that had been completely sealed off from the rest of the basement. Unlike the hidden alcove where TJ's remains were found, this room was pristine, untouched by the fire that had damaged the rest of the house. Inside, they discovered Vaughn's most carefully guarded secrets. Metal filing cabinets lined one wall, filled with meticulously organized documents, photographs, and audio recordings. A small desk sat in the corner, covered with journals written in Vaughn's cramped handwriting. Most chilling of all, the walls were covered with photographs, dozens of young black boys, some taken from a distance as they walked to school or played in parks. "Jesus Christ," Cassidy whispered as she surveyed the room. "This is his trophy collection." Devon, who had arrived at the scene within hours of the discovery, felt sick as he examined the photographs. Some of the boys looked familiar from missing persons reports he'd researched over the years. Others were smiling happily at the camera, apparently unaware they were being stalked, but it was the audio recordings that provided the most damning evidence. Vaughn had apparently been recording his conversations with Gregory Langston Sr. for years, perhaps as insurance against the day when he might need to protect himself. The first tape they played was dated 3 days before TJ's disappearance. Vaughn's voice was nervous, agitated. "I don't know about this, Mr. Langston. The boy saw something, but killing him? That's a big step." Langston Sr.'s voice was cold, authoritative. "Harold, we've been through this. The boy is a problem that will only get bigger. His mother is already asking too many questions, and if he starts talking about what he saw... But he's just a kid. Maybe we could scare him, make him keep quiet." "Scare him?" Langston's laugh was humorless. "You think a boy like that will stay scared? No, Harold. He's got that do-gooder streak, just like his mother. He'll convince himself it's his duty to speak up. We can't take that risk." There was a long pause before Vaughn spoke again. "What about the others? The Thompson boy, Wilson. They were different. They were runaways, troublemakers. Nobody looked too hard when they disappeared. TJ Jackson is different, I'll grant you. But that's exactly why he's more dangerous. People respect him, trust him. If he starts telling stories about what goes on in my house..." Langston's voice trailed off ominously. "What do you want me to do?" "What you've always done, Harold. Make the problem go away, permanently." The recording continued for several more minutes, with Langston providing specific instructions about how to lure TJ to Vaughn's house and what to do with his body afterward. By the time the tape ended, everyone in the room was silent, processing the cold-blooded nature of the planning that had gone into TJ's murder. June Jackson listened to the recording with tears streaming down her face. After 33 years of wondering what had happened to her son, she finally had the complete, horrible truth. TJ hadn't just been in the wrong place at the wrong time. He'd been systematically hunted down because his conscience wouldn't allow him to ignore what he'd witnessed. "My baby tried to do the right thing," she whispered to Cassidy. "He saw that man hurting his own child, and he wanted to help. That's what got him killed." As they continued examining Vaughn's secret files, the scope of the conspiracy became clear. The documents revealed that Langston Sr. had been operating what amounted to a pedophile ring, using his position in the community to identify and access vulnerable children. The neighborhood watch groups weren't just about maintaining racial segregation. They were cover for a systematic campaign of abuse that had claimed at least 7 victims over a 5-year period. Vaughan's journals provided a disturbing window into his deteriorating mental state. Early entries from the 1970s showed a man struggling with guilt and paranoia, but still rational enough to document his activities. As the years progressed, the writing became increasingly erratic, filled with religious references and pleas for forgiveness. One entry, dated 6 months after TJ's murder, was particularly revealing. "Can't sleep again. Keep hearing the boy screaming. Mr. G says I did what had to be done, but the boy fought so hard, scratched my face, bit my hand, kept saying he was going to tell his mama, going to make sure the other boy was safe. Even when he knew he was going to die, he was still trying to help someone else. What kind of monster have I become?" Another entry from 1976 showed Vaughan's growing fear of his co-conspirator. "Mr. G is getting careless, too confident. Brought another boy to the house last week, right in broad daylight. Neighbors are starting to talk. Mrs. Banks asked me yesterday if I'd seen anything strange. I think she knows something. If this all comes apart, Mr. G will throw me under the bus without thinking twice. Need to start keeping records just in case." It was this paranoia that had led Vaughan to create his insurance policy. The hidden, a room filled with evidence that could destroy Gregory Langston Sr. if the need arose. But Vaughan had underestimated his co-conspirator's ruthlessness. By 1977, Vaughan himself had become a liability. The final journal entry was dated October 1977. "Exactly 2 years after TJ's murder. He's coming for me tonight. I can feel it. Mr. G doesn't like loose ends, and I'm the biggest loose end of all. If anyone finds this room, know that Gregory Langston Sr. is responsible for the deaths of at least 7 children. The Jackson boy, the Thompson boy, David Wilson, Marcus Hayes, Jimmy Patterson, Carlos Mendez, and little Billy Sherman. They all died because they were inconvenient to a powerful man who thought he was above the law. I was his weapon, but he was the one who pulled the trigger every time." The journal entry explained what had happened to Harold Vaughan. He hadn't wandered off in a psychotic episode. He'd been murdered by the same man who had ordered TJ's death. Cassidy shared this information with Chief Hayes, who immediately contacted the FBI. The case had grown beyond the scope of local law enforcement, involving multiple jurisdictions and federal crimes. Agent Sarah Mitchell, a specialist in cold case homicides, was assigned to lead the federal investigation. "We're looking at a serial killer who used his position in the community to prey on children for years," Agent Mitchell explained during a briefing with the local team. Harold Vaughan was the triggerman, but Gregory Langston Sr. was the mastermind. And now we need to figure out how many other people knew what was happening and chose to look the other way. The investigation expanded to include a thorough examination of the neighborhood watch groups that Langston had funded. Financial records showed payments to dozens of individuals over the years, some legitimate security consultants, others with more questionable backgrounds. Several prominent community leaders had received significant donations from Langston's businesses, always with vague explanations about community development or youth outreach. But it was the discovery of Langston Sr.'s own files that provided the final pieces of the puzzle. Acting on a warrant, federal agents searched the Langston family estate and found a hidden safe in the basement. Inside were photographs, financial records, and correspondence that painted a complete picture of the conspiracy. The most shocking discovery was a membership list for something called the Community Protection Society, a secret organization that included several police officers, city officials, and business leaders. The society's stated purpose was maintaining community standards and protecting traditional values, but the documents made clear that this was code language for a much more sinister agenda. Meeting minutes from 1975 showed that TJ's murder had been discussed and approved by the society's leadership. They'd voted on whether to eliminate the problem child who was threatening community stability. The vote had been unanimous. Even more disturbing was evidence that TJ hadn't been their first victim. The society had been operating since the late 1960s, systematically targeting anyone who threatened their vision of how the community should function. Civil rights activists, investigative reporters, and even some white families who were too vocal in supporting integration had all faced intimidation, violence, or worse. June Jackson found herself at the center of a media firestorm as news of the conspiracy broke nationally. The story had everything that captured public attention: a missing child, powerful conspirators, decades of cover-up, and a mother's relentless search for truth. But June was uncomfortable with the attention, preferring to focus on the larger implications of what they'd uncovered. "This isn't just about my son," she told a reporter from CNN. "This is about a system that was designed to protect certain people while sacrificing others. TJ died because he saw injustice and couldn't ignore it. If we don't learn from his death, then he died for nothing." The federal grand jury convened in March 2008, just 2 months after Gregory Langston Jr.'s confession had opened the floodgates of the investigation. Despite the overwhelming evidence, the path to justice proved more complicated than anyone had anticipated. The first challenge was jurisdictional. TJ's murder had occurred in 1975, crossing multiple jurisdictions and involving victims from several different communities. Federal prosecutors had to coordinate with local authorities in 3 different counties, each with their own political considerations and varying levels of enthusiasm for pursuing decades-old cases. The second challenge was practical. Most of the primary conspirators were dead. Gregory Langston Sr. had died of a heart attack in 1989. Harold Vaughn had been murdered in 1977. Of the 12 men identified as members of the Community Protection Society, only 4 were still alive, and 2 of those were suffering from advanced dementia. But Agent Mitchell and the federal prosecution team were determined to pursue whatever justice was possible. They focused on the 2 surviving society members, who were mentally competent: former police detective Robert Crawford and businessman William Hayes. Crawford, now 78 and living in a retirement community in Florida, had been one of the officers who deliberately sabotaged the original investigation into TJ's disappearance. Financial records showed he'd received regular payments from Langston Sr. throughout the 1970s and 1980s, ostensibly for security consulting, but actually for his role in covering up the conspiracy's crimes. Hayes, 69 and still active, in St. Louis business circles, had used his construction company to dispose of evidence and bodies over the years. Soil samples from properties his company had developed in the 1970s revealed trace amounts of human remains, suggesting that TJ and Vaughn weren't the only victims buried in unmarked graves. While the federal case slowly moved through the courts, Cassidy made a decision that would change the trajectory of the entire investigation. Against the advice of prosecutors who wanted to keep evidence confidential until trial, she leaked portions of the audio recordings to social media. The reaction was immediate and explosive. The recordings went viral within hours, shared millions of times across Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. The cold, calculated way that Langston Sr. and Vaughn discussed murdering a 15-year-old boy shocked people across the country and around the world. Civil rights organizations seized on the story as an example of systemic racism and violence against black communities. The NAACP organized protests in St. Louis, demanding not just justice for TJ, but a broader investigation into how many other cases had been covered up over the years. Timothy Jackson's murder wasn't an isolated incident, NAACP President Benjamin Jealous said at a rally attended by thousands. It was part of a systematic campaign of terror designed to keep black families in their place. How many other children died because they dared to speak truth to power? The public pressure created by the leaked recordings had an unexpected effect on the case. People who had remained silent for decades began coming forward with information. A former maid who had worked for the Langston family called the FBI tip line to report that she'd seen Gregory Langston Sr. with young boys on multiple occasions. A retired nurse came forward to say she'd treated several children over the years for injuries consistent with sexual abuse, and that she'd been told by supervisors not to report her suspicions. Most significantly, Maria Gonzalez, who had been Harold Vaughan's neighbor in 1975, contacted investigators with information that corroborated key details from the recordings. She had kept a diary during that period, and her entries from October 1975 described strange sounds coming from Vaughan's basement and a young black boy she'd seen being forced into the house by two men. "I was young then, just 22, and I was scared," Gonzalez told Agent Mitchell. "My English wasn't very good, and when I tried to tell the police what I'd seen, they acted like I was making it up. They said maybe I'd seen the boy going to deliver a paper, not being forced inside. They made me feel like I was the one doing something wrong." Gonzalez's diary entry from October 16, 1975, the day after TJ's disappearance, was particularly damning. "Heard terrible screaming from next door last night. Sounded like a child. This morning, there were two cars in Harold's driveway, including the fancy blue one that comes around sometimes. Saw them carrying something heavy wrapped in a tarp out to one of the cars. Harold looked sick, like he was going to throw up. I think something very bad happened." Armed with this new testimony and the evidence from Vaughan's hidden room, prosecutors felt confident enough to move forward with charges. In July 2008, Robert Crawford and William Hayes were indicted on federal charges, including conspiracy to commit murder, civil rights violations, and obstruction of justice. The trial began in February 2009 and lasted 3 months. The prosecution's case was built around the audio recordings, Vaughan's journals, and testimony from survivors and witnesses who had finally found the courage to speak. June Jackson testified about the impact of losing her son and her decades-long search for answers. "They didn't just kill my boy," she told the jury, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "They killed my faith in justice, my trust in the system that was supposed to protect us. They made me believe, for 33 years, that my son had run away, that I had somehow failed as a mother. That was almost worse than knowing he was dead." The defense tried to argue that their clients had been following orders from Gregory Langston Sr. and couldn't be held responsible for his crimes. But the prosecution had evidence showing that both Crawford and Hayes had been active participants who had profited from their involvement. Crawford's role in sabotaging the original investigation was particularly damning. Phone records showed that he had received calls from Langston Sr. within hours of TJ's disappearance, and his official reports contained deliberate falsifications designed to misdirect the investigation. Hayes's construction company had been used to dispose of evidence, and possibly other bodies. Excavations at 3 different properties his company had developed in the 1970s had revealed disturbed soil and trace evidence of human remains. The jury deliberated for 2 days before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Crawford was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. Hayes received 30 years. Neither man showed any remorse during sentencing, maintaining their innocence despite the overwhelming evidence. But for June Jackson, the convictions felt like only partial justice. The men who had actually murdered her son were long dead, and the full scope of the conspiracy would never be completely understood. Too many witnesses had died, too much evidence had been destroyed, and too many years had passed. The civil case proved more satisfying. June filed wrongful death lawsuits against the estates of Gregory Langston Sr. and Harold Vaughan, as well as against the city of Millbrook Heights for the police department's deliberate mishandling of the investigation. The city settled quickly, agreeing to pay $2.3 million and to implement new protocols for investigating missing persons cases, particularly those involving minority children. The settlement also included funding for a cold case unit specifically dedicated to re-examining unsolved disappearances from the 1960s and 1970s. The Langston estate fought the lawsuit vigorously, but the evidence was overwhelming. Gregory Langston Jr. testified against his own family's interests, providing details about his father's crimes that hadn't been revealed during the criminal trial. In the end, the estate agreed to a $5.7 million settlement, rather than face a public trial that would have exposed even more damaging information. June used the settlement money to establish the Timothy Jackson Foundation, dedicated to supporting families of missing children and advocating for reforms in how law enforcement handles such cases. The foundation also funded scholarships for aspiring journalists, honoring TJ's dream of using words to fight injustice. TJ always wanted to be a reporter, June said at the foundation's inaugural event. He believed that truth was the most powerful weapon against evil. This foundation will help other young people carry on that fight. Cassidy's career was transformed by her work on the case. She was promoted to chief of the state crime lab and became a nationally recognized expert on cold case investigations. But the case also took a personal toll. The months of examining evidence of child abuse and murder had left her struggling with nightmares and anxiety. "Sometimes I wonder if we did the right thing by digging all this up," she confided to Devin during one of their regular dinners. "Look at all the pain it's caused. All the families who now know their loved ones are dead instead of just missing." Devin, who had won a Pulitzer Prize for his series of articles about the case, understood her struggle. "The truth doesn't always heal," he said, "but lies always poison. At least now these families know what happened. At least now they can grieve properly." The case had broader implications beyond the immediate prosecutions. The revelation that police officers and city officials had been part of a conspiracy to murder children led to a federal investigation of law enforcement practices in the region. Several other officers were forced to resign, and new oversight procedures were implemented. The story also sparked a national conversation about missing children cases and racial bias in law enforcement. Studies showed that cases involving missing Black children received significantly less media attention and fewer resources than similar cases involving white children. TJ's story became a rallying point for advocates pushing for reform. But perhaps the most important impact was on the community of Millbrook Heights itself. The revelation that respected community leaders had been involved in systematic child murder forced residents to confront uncomfortable truths about their neighborhood's history. A community healing process began, led by local churches and civic organizations. Memorials were erected for TJ and the other victims. Annual vigils were held to remember the children who had been lost and to commit to protecting future generations. Gregory Langston Jr., meanwhile, had withdrawn from public life entirely. His Senate campaign had collapsed immediately after his confession, and he'd resigned from all his business and civic positions. He sold the family estate and donated the proceeds to victim advocacy organizations. "I can't undo what my father did," he said in his final public statement, "but I can make sure that his legacy is one of justice for his victims, not wealth and power built on their graves." 5 years after the convictions of Crawford and Hayes, Cassidy found herself returning to the investigation that had defined her career. Now the chief of Missouri's cold case division, She was reviewing files that had been overlooked during the original investigation when she made a discovery that sent chills down her spine. In a box of evidence from a 1976 case in Kansas City, she found photographs and documents that suggested the Community Protection Society's influence had extended far beyond St. Louis. The case involved the disappearance of 3 black teenagers who had been organizing voter registration drives. In their community, like TJ, they had simply vanished one day, their bodies never found. But what caught Cassidy's attention wasn't just the similarity of the cases, it was a financial document showing a wire transfer from one of Gregory Langston Sr.'s shell companies to a security firm in Kansas City just days before the teenagers disappeared. She immediately called Devin, who had spent the past 5 years writing a book about TJ's case and investigating similar disappearances across the Midwest. "I think we've only seen the tip of the iceberg," she told him. "This thing was bigger than we ever imagined." Devin's research had already uncovered troubling patterns. Between 1968 and 1978, more than 40 black teenagers and young adults had disappeared from communities across Missouri, Illinois, and Kansas. Most had been involved in civil rights activities, voter registration, or other forms of activism. Almost none of their cases had received serious investigation from local authorities. "It's like there was a systematic campaign to eliminate an entire generation of young black leaders," Devin said. "And it looks like the Community Protection Society was just one node in a much larger network." The implications were staggering. If Cassidy and Devin were right, TJ's murder wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a coordinated effort to suppress black political organizing through terror and violence. The scope of the conspiracy dwarfed anything they had previously imagined. Agent Mitchell, who had moved to the FBI's Civil Rights Division after the successful prosecutions in TJ's case, agreed to open a broader investigation. Using TJ's case as a template, federal investigators began re-examining cold cases across multiple states, looking for similar patterns of disappearances, cover-ups, and financial connections. The investigation, codenamed Operation Lost Voices, eventually identified more than 200 cases that showed suspicious similarities. Many involved young black activists, journalists, or community organizers who had vanished without trace. In almost every case, local investigations had been perfunctory, with authorities quickly concluding that the victims had simply left town or were involved with drugs or gangs. But the new investigation also revealed something hopeful: survivors. People who had been targeted by the conspiracy but had managed to escape, or whose families had hidden them when threats became too severe. These survivors, now in their 50s and 60s, began coming forward with stories that filled in gaps. In the historical record, Marcus Washington had been a 19-year-old college student in 1974 when he'd been warned by his pastor that white men had been asking questions about him in his neighborhood. His family had immediately sent him to live with relatives in California, probably saving his life. "I always wondered why my parents were so scared," Washington told investigators. "Now I understand. They knew what happened to kids like me who stayed and fought." The survivor stories provided crucial intelligence that helped investigators understand how the conspiracy had operated. Targets were usually identified through informants in black communities, sometimes church members or community leaders who were being blackmailed or bribed. Once identified, targets would be surveilled for weeks or months before being eliminated. The operation had been sophisticated, using legitimate businesses and organizations as fronts while maintaining plausible deniability for its leadership. Financial records showed that funding had come from a network of wealthy individuals and corporations who shared the goal of maintaining racial segregation through any means necessary. June Jackson, now in her 70s, watched the expansion of the investigation with a mixture of pride and sorrow. TJ's murder had opened a door to understanding a much larger pattern of violence, But each new revelation brought fresh pain for families who had been wondering about their lost loved ones for decades. The Timothy Jackson Foundation became a clearinghouse for information about the broader conspiracy, providing support for families and coordinating with investigators. June found herself counseling parents and siblings who were finally learning the truth about disappearances that had haunted their families for generations. "Every family that gets answers is a victory for TJ," she said during an interview with 60 Minutes. "My son died trying to protect another child from abuse. Now his story is helping protect other families from never knowing what happened to their loved ones." The foundation also funded the creation of a national database of unsolved disappearances, with particular focus on cases involving minority children and young adults. The database helped investigators identify patterns and connections that had been missed by local authorities who either lacked resources or weren't motivated to investigate thoroughly. But perhaps the most important work of the foundation was educational. June began speaking at schools and community centers, telling TJ's story and emphasizing the importance of speaking up when witnessing injustice. "My son saw something terrible happening to another child, and he couldn't stay silent," she would tell her audiences. "That moral courage cost him his life, but it also saved other children from suffering the same abuse. If we teach our children to have that same courage, maybe we can prevent future tragedies." The foundation also worked to reform how law enforcement handled missing persons cases. June testified before Congress about the need for standardized protocols and federal oversight when local investigations appeared inadequate. The Timothy Jackson Act, passed in 2015, required federal involvement in any missing child case where local authorities failed to make significant progress within 30 days. Cassidy's career continued to flourish as she became one of the nation's leading experts on cold case investigations. She developed new techniques for analyzing old evidence with modern technology and created training programs for law enforcement agencies across the country. But the TJ case remained personal for her. She kept a photo of TJ on her desk, the school picture that showed him smiling in his pressed shirt, newspaper bag over his shoulder, ready to take on the world with truth and determination. He was going to be a journalist, she would tell new investigators who joined her team. He believed that exposing the truth could change the world. In a way, he was right. His story has changed how we investigate these cases, how we support families, how we think about justice. Devon's book, The Last Delivery, How a Newspaper Boy's Murder Exposed a Conspiracy of Terror, became a bestseller and was adapted into a documentary that won an Emmy Award. But for Devon, the most meaningful recognition came from the journalism. School at the University of Missouri, which established the Timothy Jackson Scholarship for students committed to investigative reporting. TJ never got the chance to become the journalist he dreamed of being, Devon said at the scholarship's first award ceremony. But through his story, he's inspiring a new generation of truth-tellers who will carry on his mission. Gregory Langston Jr. had largely disappeared from public view, but he occasionally surfaced to support the Foundation's work. He had spent years in therapy, processing the trauma of his childhood abuse and the guilt of his father's crimes. In 2013, he published a memoir about his experiences, donating all proceeds to victim advocacy organizations. "I can't change what my father did," he wrote in the book's conclusion, "but I can make sure that his victims are remembered and that their stories help prevent future crimes. Timothy Jackson died because he tried to protect me from my father's abuse. The least I can do is spend the rest of my life honoring his memory." The neighborhood of Millbrook Heights had also transformed in the years following the case. The racial tensions that had defined the community in the 1970s had gradually given way to a more integrated and cooperative community. The revelation of the conspiracy had forced residents to confront their history and work together to build something better. TJ's old newspaper route had been turned into a memorial walk, with markers at significant locations telling the story of his life and death. The route ended at a small park that had been built on the site of Harold Vaughan's house, featuring a bronze statue of TJ with his newspaper bag and bicycle. The statue's inscription read, "Timothy T.J. Jackson, 1960-1975. He died seeking truth and protecting the innocent. His courage lives on in all who refuse to look away from injustice." On the 40th anniversary of TJ's disappearance, hundreds of people gathered at the Memorial Park for the annual vigil. June Jackson, now 83 and using a walker, was helped to the podium to address the crowd. 40 years ago, my son, TJ, left home to deliver newspapers and never came back, she began, her voice still strong despite her age. For 33 years, I didn't know what had happened to him. I didn't know if he was alive or dead, if he was suffering somewhere, or if he had chosen to leave us. She paused, looking out at the crowd that included families of other victims, law enforcement officials, civil rights leaders, and community members who had been touched by TJ's story. Now I know the truth. My son died because he had the courage to stand up for what was right, even when it was dangerous. He saw injustice and refused to look away. He tried to protect a child who was being hurt, and that moral courage cost him his life. June's voice grew stronger as she continued, but TJ's death wasn't meaningless. His story has helped solve hundreds of other cases. It's changed how we investigate missing children. It's brought justice to families who thought they would never have answers. It's inspired young people to pursue truth and justice, even when it's difficult. She gestured toward the statue behind her. TJ wanted to be a journalist. He wanted to use words to fight injustice and protect the innocent. In a way, he succeeded. His story has been told around the world. It's opened eyes and changed minds, and saved lives. As the vigil concluded with the reading of names of all the victims whose cases had been connected to the broader conspiracy, June felt a sense of peace that had eluded her for 4 decades. TJ's story had finally been told in full. Justice had been served, even if imperfectly, and most importantly, his death had meaning. It had made the world a little bit safer for children like him. The investigation would continue, with new cases being added to the database and new connections being discovered. But for June Jackson, the most important work was done. Her son was no longer a forgotten victim. He was remembered as a hero who had died trying to protect another child, whose courage had ultimately exposed a conspiracy of evil and brought some measure of justice to its victims. As the crowd dispersed and the candles were extinguished, June remained by the statue for a few more minutes, touching the bronze face that looked so much like her son. "You did good, baby," she whispered. "You did real good." What would you have done if you were 15 years old and witnessed something horrific? Would you have had the courage to speak up, knowing it might cost you everything? If Timothy's story moved you, please like this video and subscribe for more untold stories of ordinary people who showed extraordinary courage in the face of evil.